Welcome back to the Lars, Larson Show. It's Tuesday night. Glad to get your phone calls and your emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. It is astounding to think about America's national debt being at nearly $28 trillion at this point and counting. The numbers have gone up so dramatically. The national debt, if I remember the numbers correctly, was about $10 trillion when Obama came in, about $18 trillion when Obama left office, now at $28 trillion. And yes, the China virus pandemic is a big piece of that because of the extraordinary spending that was done last year. Whether for good or bad, we can debate that all day long. But I want to welcome to the program Saul Anuzis, who is the president of the 60 Plus Association, which is a conservative senior group, and former head of the Michigan GOP. Mr. Anuzis, welcome to the program.
Lars, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So what do we do about this problem? And we can solve it all in about 7 or 8 minutes tonight, right?
There you go. That's the easy way. Well, I think the Georgia Senate elections was really a clarion call to Americans across the country to realize that, we're in a very perilous situation where the Democrats now control both houses of the legislature and the presidency, and they, for all practical purposes, can do whatever they want to do. And the only way we're going to limit the power of Congress is to basically call for a constitutional convention or have a constitutional amendment that actually forces the limitation on what Congress can do. So there's two ways of doing it. One is an introduction of a constitutional amendment that Congress does and then is ratified by 2/3 of the state. Or the second proposal, which we're working on right now, is basically having 2/3 of the states actually call for a limited single-issue constitutional convention under Article 5 of the Constitution. And we're only 6 states away. 28 states have already passed this resolution. We're targeting about 10 states that, have been having conversations and look like they're possible states to pass. And we need 6 of those 10 to actually do that. And, then we could actually have a constitutional convention. Now, I believe if we actually get up to 3 or 4 states, where we're only 2 or 3 states away, Congress will probably act on its own to pass a constitutional amendment because they'll want to define what it looks like and what provisions are and what escape hatches are in there. So one way or the other, we just need to get the people across the country to, motivate their state legislators to act, which I think will then get Congress to act.
Saul, can I call you Saul tonight? Because I want to rip through a couple of these issues quickly. The problem with Congress defining it and saying one way or the other is that if Congress does it, they'll put the escape hatches in. We have limits that are in on federal spending, and then they just vote around them and say we're going to bust the limit. We hear about that all the time. It's become the new norm. So unless we had a hard and fast, balanced budget amendment that said, like, I think all of the state. There might be 1 or 2 states that actually are allowed to exceed. I know California and New York do deficit spending, but most states are not allowed to do deficit spending. You have to spend within your means, and it forces a kind of limitation on what they do. They do find a few ways around it, but for the most part, they live within their budgets.
Absolutely, and I think that's the critical thing, that most of the country does operate that way. But the federal government, which is kind of removed from the people, and a lot of people don't really follow it or understand it to the level they should, it's a very dangerous position because you're borrowing the kinds of money that are indebting our children and grandchildren to levels that are really unsustainable. Traditionally, we've tried to keep the deficit down at about 18% of gross domestic product. And after the last 2 years, we've broken 120% of gross domestic product. In 2020, we don't have the final numbers yet, but like 16 to 17% of the entire federal budget will be spent just on paying interest on the debt. And so it's really, to me, it's an existential threat in the sense that, the only way our country stays strong is because of our economy. And if all of a sudden we can't pay our debts, we can't live within our means, foreigners stop, lending us money, this could be very detrimental to the country as a whole.
Absolutely. But let me ask you, Saul, let's assume that amendment was in place right now, and we're spending at least $1 trillion beyond what we take in every year. 2 possible answers: cut dramatically or increase taxes or increase other revenues coming in. And I would allow for all 3. But even if you allow for all 3, I'm told that about 2/3 of the federal government's budget is spent on so-called entitlements. Though that term makes some people angry, but it shouldn't. If you've worked for Social Security and Medicare, you are entitled to get it. That's all they mean by that.
Right.
But when 2/3 of the money is going for that, and you say let's make a sizable cut in spending, can you cut spending in a sizable way without cutting into those entitlements, which I always translate as whose grandmother do you want to cut the Social Security check for? Because that's effectively what it means, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And most people have paid into the system, and therefore it's really their money that we're talking about coming back to them to pay for their retirements. But, there have been several proposals. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky has had a proposal where, you basically take 2% a year off the budget across the board and start cutting it back until you balance the budget. So there's ways to do that without being draconian and doing it overnight. And, I think if you took a look at 2% out of every dollar spent in the federal government, I think year by year you could slowly find inefficiencies and cuts that would actually make sense. And also, by doing that, I think you increase economic activity, which by definition would mean we would have, more revenues coming in. So there's a big belief that the only way to really get out of our deficit is to actually grow our way out. And I think that's what President Trump was on his way doing, basically deregulating, lowering taxes, getting the highest, employment levels we ever had in this country, and seeing, the kinds of economic growth that were necessary to pay back this deficit. But if you just keep spending, you're not going to stop that cycle. And that's the problem we have right now. And so that's what we're trying to do is motivate seniors who are, one of the strongest, biggest political voting blocs in the country and virtually every state in the country to kind of get behind this and start calling your legislators and letting them know, look, it's time for a balanced budget amendment, and we shouldn't count on 2 swing seats in the state of Georgia to determine whether, the Democrats or Republicans control it, because oftentimes the Republicans aren't that much better than the Democrats when it comes to spending and deficits.
They're not. And Saul, one of the ideas I like is the idea of increasing the amount of money the federal government can make on things. Well, Biden just put a hole in that by saying we're not going to lease lands for oil and gas drilling, and that's a big revenue producer. The federal forests are severely underutilized, and they should be. Cut and plant. You can make billions of dollars there. And even the penny plan, which I think is a variation of what Rand Paul has talked about, where you say to every federal agency, instead of planning on a 6% increase next year, because most people in America don't have a 6% pay increase every year, next year you get 99 cents for everything where you had $1 this year. And you say, so Forest Service, Interior Department, Commerce Department, you're going to slowly figure out what is the most important stuff that you spend money on, and you're going to cut the less important stuff, and all of that could get us to a balanced budget, just not immediately. Saul, you want to tell people where they can find the 60 Plus Association online very quickly?
Yeah, we appreciate it. So if you go to www.60plus, which is spelled out plus.org, so 60plus.org, we have our website. We've got a place you can go and take a look at what the balanced budget amendment is all about and where we're going there. And we would love to have your support. And if you want more information about it, just go to www.60plus.org.